Hello, and welcome back to the Life on the Wrist podcast. I think it's also worth noting this is going to be the first official podcast of 2024. So I want to wish everyone a really, really happy new year. I hope your celebrations were with friends and family, or at least loved ones who were worth spending the New Year's with. It's been, I think, reflecting on 2023, it was a great year for many of us. It might have been a bad year for some of us. I hope that 2024 improves on what you've already accomplished or come from in 2023. What is also really exciting is this is the 5th season of the Life on the Wrist podcast officially. Episode 1 of season 5, which I can't actually believe that we're already on the 5th season of this podcast. Feels like just a couple months ago that we started this podcast, and we've already recorded 157 episodes with 5 seasons. So it's just really exciting going into 2024 with this podcast. If you don't know a lot about this podcast, I'll just give a quick little bit of information on it. So this podcast obviously is from, broadcast from the lifeonthewrist.com website. We have a variety of sort of outlets where we create watch-related content, one of them being the editorial section of our website, where we cover we basically want that to be for watch reviews. So we look at a lot of really cool and interesting vintage pieces, talk about their histories, the history of the brands, the history of the calibers that run in them, and the references that we're able to source. And it's been really enjoyable this year doing so, because we've been able to experience so much diversity in vintage watches, and I think that's really what makes it so exciting. We used to cover sort of current events in the watch world on in the editorial sort of part of our website, but we kind of have shifted away from that. With each of those articles, we also have videos where we cover, where we give an in-depth look at one of the pieces, and it allows you to really see the watch moving, see the watch in the metal, and allows you to sort of appreciate more than just pictures of the piece. So I think our YouTube channel and our editorial sort of go hand in hand. We then have our podcast, which, as I mentioned, we used to cover current events in the editorial section and also on our YouTube channel. But I think what we've really done is sort of shifted the focus of our podcast to cover those current events and look at the things that have happened in the watch industry over the last week. We upload this podcast every Tuesdays when we typically post this podcast. And it's really fun to kind of look back, because what's really interesting is, you wouldn't think that in an industry like watches, there would be something new to talk about every single week. And there isn't always, and sometimes we have to come up with some interesting topics that are not sort of current events. However, most of the time, there's at least one piece of news that comes out every single week. And I think this has been a nice outlet for us to stay current with what's going on in the watch industry, but also mix in our own sort of flavor that Life on the Wrist brings. So today we're actually going to start off with giving you a little bit of a look at some of the pieces that we're going to be covering on the editorial section of our website, as well as our YouTube channel. Now, we have done an article on the pieces that we're going to be covering over the next several weeks. So I'll put a link in the description or the show notes of this video so you can see those pieces. But I wanted to speak through them on the podcast as well, because I do think they are extremely interesting and a nice way to sort of kick off the new year. So the first piece that we have in is a really beautiful Eterna-Matic that's in steel and has a really cool black dial. The watch itself is, I think, 33.5 millimeters, so a little bit on the smaller side, but is a really nice example of a steel vintage watch. Black dials are obviously very, very popular with collectors, and this example has an interesting patina to it. So if you look at the dial of this piece, there is what collectors call sort of a spiderweb patina, which is essentially cracks that have emerged on the dial that create this sort of spiderweb pattern on it. Again, patina is very subjective, and you have to like that sort of aesthetic of that piece. But I really love it. I think from an aesthetic perspective, it's really great. But I also think that the Eterna-Matic is a wonderful example of innovation in the watch industry. And that's something that I've always sort of kept at the forefront of my mind when I think about watches is how is that watch innovating for the industry. And when you're exploring vintage pieces, it's very easy to sort of put those things together because I think vintage pieces, it was all about innovation, or for a lot of the times it was about innovation because these were tools. And so a really nice Eterna-Matic. I really liked it. Like the overall look of it. They also sort of innovated on the automatic movement by adding their ball bearing system into the rotor of the movement. I'm not going to spoil it because I want you'll have to check out the article that we write about this in the video that we shoot for this Eterna-Matic, where we go a little bit in depth into what that system actually did. But I really like this piece from an innovation perspective and overall aesthetics. The next piece that we have that we're covering, and if you follow Life on the Wrist, you will obviously know that we have touted this line of watches as one of the best vintage watches that you can buy, and that is the LeCoultre Memovox. It's always I always feel like somewhat of some pressure when I am trying to find pieces that I want to cover on the channel that are Memovoxes, because Memovoxes are really tough to find in good condition. A lot of the times the watches might be in bad condition, over polished, dials replaced, dials refinished, and so it's oftentimes and also crowns replaced. So oftentimes it's hard to find those really great examples. But today we were able to find a reference 3025 from 1962 that has a 10-karat gold-filled case. Really, really beautiful example of this, especially when you look at the dial of this piece, because the inner disc, so it's a silver dial, but the inner disc has a beautiful layer of sort of a gold hue patina to it, and I think it has a really great look to it. Condition of the watch is really great, and I think this is a phenomenal example of a watch a phenomenal example of a Memovox that I wanted to cover on the channel. So I was very excited to find this piece and obviously share this watch with you. So the video of this piece, I think, is what you really want to see, so you can see how the watch is aged. It's truly a beautiful piece. Black dials have kind of been a theme for this sort of section of watches. We were able to find a really beautiful Longines that was manufactured in 1953. Interestingly, on the case back of the watch, it says that it is a 10-karat gold-filled case, but when you look at the watch, it looks like it's a stainless steel case. So kind of an interesting intersection of that. What likely happened is a watchmaker likely saw that the gold filling was coming off on the watch, and so they probably polished it off, exposing the steel case. But I do think that the steel case still remains a really beautiful in really beautiful condition. It's really, really good looking. The thing is, though, the black dial of this piece is to die for. So it's black dial. It still remains a lot of its, quite dark appearance, but it has these specks that have appeared on the dial. But super, super strong dial. It has these recessed hour markers that look incredibly beautiful. Sword hands. The circular finishing on the subsidiary seconds dial looks great. The logo and the Longines name are in really great condition, and I think it's everything that someone would want in a black dial piece. It's a bit of an enigma, so the research on this piece has been kind of interesting, but I seriously think this is one of the best looking black dials that I've seen in a very long time. And what's really cool is this is a 34mm cased watch. However, the lugs are really flat, unlike the Eterna-Matic where they kind of angle towards your wrist, so it sits really nicely. The Longines sits quite flat, but still sits very, very comfortably, and so for a 34mm watch, it kind of wears a little bit larger. We had to have sort of an icon going into 2024. We decided to cover a Tudor Prince Oyster Date reference 74033. It's really a staple in any collector's collection. Is a fluted bezel watch with a date complication. You can think Rolex date just, Rolex date, Tudor Oyster Date. It's, I think, a staple in a lot of collectors' collections. It's also a really great first watch to get. The watch is from 1997 and has a 34mm case with an 18-karat gold fluted bezel. The case is in really great condition. There's some scratches on the case back, but overall in really great condition. You can still see sort of the polish and brush finishing on the different sides of the watch. It's running on the Tudor 2824 movement, which is really great. I've combined it with this really interesting blue strap, which I think gold and blue is a great combination. It does have a Jubilee bracelet as well, so if that sort of tickles your fancy, it also has that. But what's really unique about this watch is that it has a gold linen dial. The gold linen dial is incredibly beautiful. Many people think that linen dials are actual pieces of linen that have been applied onto the dial, but it's actually just a type of finishing that a watchmaker can do to a gold dial like this. So really incredibly beautiful and kind of a unique dial. Speaking of unique dials and kind of unique watches, the last piece that we have in is a really cool Benrus time-only piece. The watch, and this is another piece that's been tricky to do some research on, but I can kind of talk through what I've found so far. So this is on its outside. It's a 10-karat gold-filled case watch with a stainless steel case back. Obviously, it's a round design, but it has these really interesting hooded lugs that sort of twist into the brown leather strap that it comes on. So from a design perspective, this watch is really standing on the top of that hill. It's got hours and minutes in the center and then a subsidiary seconds dial. Interestingly, it's got a really beautiful honeycomb dial, which I know Benrus played around a lot with honeycomb dials. A lot of their pieces had them. And for me, I think this is a piece that is really representative of last year. It is an interesting case design. It's an interesting dial, and it's rare. I really haven't been able to find a lot of pictures or other examples of this Benrus out there, and I think that is what kind of makes it really, really special for the channel, and I'm very, very excited to cover it. It's running on the caliber DN21 movement, which is based on the ETA 1280 movement. Places it around in the 1950s. Unfortunately, serial numbers are... I've been struggling to find serial numbers of this watch, so it's hard to sort of date it. But based on that movement and when that movement was manufactured and used, that's kind of when I would say it's from. So those 5 watches are kind of we're going into 2024 with these 5 watches. We're going to be covering one each week, as we always do. So stay tuned for that. It's been really, really fun to find these pieces, and then obviously covering them is going to be very, very exciting. And I think the research is what's really where my passion comes. And it's interesting. We've been thinking a lot about sort of the values that Life on the Wrist sort of tries to foster. And I think that values when it comes to a business can be somewhat interesting, or to a YouTube channel or a website can be somewhat interesting to discuss, because at the end of the day, I think it feels a little esoteric sometimes when you speak about it that way. But I do think that this year has really shown me that it's important that we actually speak about it, because there are some extremely important things to me and sort of the goals that I have for Life on the Wrist, because I wouldn't continue to do this if I didn't have them. So I really think we have 3 goals, right? Explore and enjoy the world of watches, whether that's vintage, whether that's modern, whether that's quartz, mechanical, whether that's clocks, whether that's pocket watches. Like, all of that is there to be enjoyed, and I want to make sure that you, as a listener, as a viewer, as a reader of Life on the Wrist, can do exactly that with me. The second is to educate watch enthusiasts about horology. And that's where I think the editorial section of our website is really important. We want to speak about these pieces and educate you on them, and tell you why the Eterna-Matic movement was so innovative during that time period, or why the Memovox is such great value in vintage watches. Like, that is what, and the histories of brands like Longines and Tudor, like that's what really the focus of the editorial section, as well as our YouTube channel, is. And I really think that, for me, that's the greatest thing about those things. And then the third thing is really to create a repository of information related to vintage watches. I think it's very difficult sometimes to research these pieces, or research watches, because the information is so spread out. There's so many people with so much knowledge about these references and movements, but sometimes you have to kind of piece it together. And so I think this is something that we're continuously working on to try and create that repository of information about vintage watches. So it's easy to look up a brand and find something out about a watch maybe you have, or a watch you're thinking about buying. That's really the main focus. So, thinking about those goals, I think these pieces are a great sort of segue into that, and I can't wait to dive into them going into 2024. We will try and upload on this podcast the next couple of weeks. This month is a little bit busy, but we're going to do our best to have some content for you every week. It might not be the most current, but we will at least cover some of the topics or some of the things that are going on in the watch industry during this first month. So stay tuned for that. If you are new to Life on the Wrist, be sure to follow this podcast so you were the first one notified when we do upload our podcast. But as I mentioned, we upload a podcast every Tuesday, so look out for the Life on the Wrist podcast on Tuesdays. If you are new to Life on the Wrist in general, be sure to check out all our social medias and check out lifeonthewrist.com if you want some more watch content. Lifeonthewrist.com is a really great place, sort of hub where you can go to the other pieces of our content. So I would definitely recommend checking out the website. If you are feeling generous and wouldn't mind rating this podcast, it really does help me out. It gives me some feedback on what you want to see going forward for the podcast. And if you find this podcast useful and want to share it with a friend, that would be great as well. With that said, guys, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. Happy New Year. Happy 2024. I hope this year is going to be a great one for all of us. And we will catch you in the next one.